when God moves, we have to deploy the system. We have to deploy the procedure so that we can steward the move of God or the revival or the renewal or the outbreak, so that we can be making sure that we are seeing this thing move forward into perpetuity, that it's not just fizzling out or we're not missing out on what God's going to do in the life of our church. So we've been talking a little bit about revivals. We've been talking about moves of God, and that was a theme that was being shared about at National Conference. And there are a number of churches within our movement and outside our movement that are experiencing some really unprecedented, miraculous experiences in the life of their churches. And so I just wanted to briefly talk about what I think is important for us as leaders for our church as we begin and continue to see those kinds of experiences. And I really do believe that's sort of the reason why we've been seeing what we've been seeing at Easter, and then subsequent to that, just really inexplicable, God moments in the life of our church. And often in revivals, they can often be short-lived because God will move and things will happen, but we don't often steward those things as well as we probably could. And I just wanted to speak to that because I think we could be prepared for that as a church. And when we read the biblical narrative and we see God moving, we actually, there's a theological concept that God is always active, that God is always moving, that God's always at work. And he also, not only he himself is moving, but he's actually moving us toward himself and, reconciling the world to himself throughout the biblical narrative. And like in the Old Testament, we see that very literally the camp of the Israelites, when it saw God move, like the pillar of smoke or the cloud or the fire by night, that was a visible evidence of God moving, and the people of God had to pack up all of their stuff and move with God. They couldn't just stay where they were and expect to experience the presence of God and wait for God to come back to them. So there was the sense of following God, even in the Old Testament, very literally. And then in the New Testament, actually pre-Pentecost, God is Jesus, and Jesus was very active, was going from place to place, moving from town to town, and being active and involved in the community that he was finding himself in. And so he was always on, and the people of God at the time, the disciples, they had to follow Jesus to be a part of what the move of God, was doing in that place. And then once we have Pentecost and Jesus returns to heaven, he leaves the Holy Spirit with us. And then today we experience the move of God and the visitation of God. It's manifest by the work of the Spirit of God. And so it's important for us as followers of Jesus to be aware of the movement of the Spirit. So whether it's, a Holy Spirit revival or an awakening or renewal, we actually have it upon us. It's incumbent upon us to move with God. So I hope that makes sense. So what we saw at National Conference was this pointing toward the revival that God's doing in his church in our country. One of the speakers got up and said, there's been a mistake that's been made over the years where as churches, we often see the movement of God like the pendulum, and the response of the church to a move of God as a pendulum on a clock, where we see the revivals and the Holy Spirit moving, and we see that as an emphasis that the church should adopt as one end of, or one extreme of, a pendulum swing, and then systems, structures, and strategies to steward that kind of revival on the other side of a pendulum swing. And therefore we have to either do one or the other for a season. And this guy was saying, well, he didn't believe that it was like that, and I don't either, that the church, instead of seeing revivals and systems and structures as two opposite ends of a pendulum, he was saying we should see them as two tracks on a railway. So we, at the same time, should see moves of God, revivals, renewals, and awakenings, whilst implementing structures, strategies, procedures to steward those well into perpetuity. And so that's what I just wanted to encourage us to think about as a church. When God's moving, when revival's breaking out, when there's a move of God taking place, our best response is to do two things. One, embrace the change that's happening, and hopefully we can't stop that because it really is a move of God. And hopefully we're powerless to quench the Spirit of God. That would be my hope. Embrace the change, And secondly, deploy our systems, deploy the systems, embrace the strategy, embrace the procedures that we know that we need. And, you even see this biblically, both in the Old and New Testament. Like if we go to Acts chapter 6, we see the story there. I'll just read a bit of it to you as we wrap up. Acts chapter 6, verse 1, it says, during this time, as the disciples were increasing in numbers, so they were having this outbreak of, response to the gospel. It says in the Message, increasing in numbers by leaps and bounds. Hard feelings developed among the Greek-speaking believers toward the Hebrew-speaking believers because their widows were being discriminated against in the daily food lines. In other words, because of this phenomenal growth, there was all this mess and all this tension and all this trouble. So God's doing this great thing, and the people of God have just panicked that no one's actually getting looked after the way they feel that they should get looked after. That sounds familiar, right? I guess I should say, as we see that happen in our church, things might get messy, but we're going to be okay with that, aren't we? We're not going to be too worried about things getting messy because, and this is what happened. So the 12 disciples called a meeting and they said, wouldn't it be right for us to abandon our responsibilities of preaching and teaching? So friends, choose 7 men from among you whom everyone trusts, full of the Holy Spirit and good sense, and we'll assign them this task. In other words, the disciples saw a need to systemize and put structure around this outbreak, this renewal, this revival, this move of God. And so that's biblical. And the same thing happens in the Old Testament. When the cloud moves or the fire moves, in Numbers chapter 4, verse 5 to 6, it says this, when the camp moves, Aaron and his sons must enter the tabernacle first and take down the inner curtain. Listen to the detail. Cover the Ark of the Covenant with it. Then they must cover the inner curtain with fine goatskin leather and spread over that a single piece of blue cloth. And finally, they must put the carrying poles in the ark in place. Again, when God moves, we have to deploy the system. We have to deploy the procedure so that we can steward the move of God or the revival or the renewal or the outbreak, so that we can be making sure that we are seeing this thing move forward into perpetuity, that it's not just fizzling out or we're not missing out on what God's going to do in the life of our church. So I just wanted to encourage us as a church to continue to do the things that we do well, to deploy our system. So it's kind of weird, isn't it? Like we're talking about revival, but I just wanted to remind us about the power and the importance of systems and structure during this next season, as we begin to step into term 2 and Creative Academy launches, and we begin Alpha again in Cessnock and Toronto. Scone's taking a re-embarking upon services. I wanted us to not forget about the importance of systems and structures. And so the 3 things I wanted to remind us about, one is to, again, return to the heart of the why of why we do what we do. Because systems simply serve the culture and culture simply serves our values. So let's remember who we are as a church, continue to communicate vision, values, culture right throughout the life of our church, wherever we go, because there's no point having systems and structures if we aren't sure about who we are and what's most important to us. So firstly, let's keep the main thing the main thing. Secondly, we've already actually built some really good scalable systems across all areas of church life, in our financial space, governance, our leadership structure and growth paths, our next steps, discipleship, the way that we reach people in our community. So let's continue to employ those. Let's not throw all those away and think, oh, well, there's all this awesome stuff happening. We're seeing all these new people connect to church, so we'll just forget about all the things that we know actually are building healthy church. And then thirdly, let's be faithful in the middle of this move. So sometimes it's easy to get excited about things when they start, and we can be motivated because of the newness of things, seeing new people say yes to Jesus, new people get water baptized. We see, new opportunities open up. But sometimes as we continue to be faithful, we can get a little bit, stuck in we can find the routine a little bit demotivating. So let's be faithful to do what we have been called to do. So in that story I read about in Acts, it's about waiting tables. It's about doing the simple day-to-day tasks, or about getting the fabric down in the tabernacle, folding the fabric, putting it on the Ark of the Covenant, all the menial things that seem like they're not as glamorous. They're actually the things that move the people of God forward Like that's the actual work that makes the real difference. Waiting the tables, folding the fabric, which for us is like just being faithfully turning up every week. Just turning up every single time we get an opportunity to turn up actually makes a difference. Week in and week out, doing the hard work, making the phone calls that we know we should be making, and rostering our teams, being on team, bringing our best into the room whenever we're there, in all areas of church life. That's what I would just encourage us to be doing, because God's doing something. It's pretty clear. And at National Conference, it was pretty clear that a lot of churches are experiencing a very similar story to us. And the other thing that we took away from that conference was this is the best time for us to make sure that we are stewarding this amazing gift from God as well as we can. And that's where deploying our systems is going to make a huge difference into this next season.